Wow, Mike, what a great conversation. Love that I come up with this crazy host voice randomly. Had a great time with Carl, learned a bunch about ghost kitchens, dynamic pricing, and I think a lot of people don't know what ghost kitchens are. They're defining them incorrectly. They're defining dynamic pricing incorrectly. So really enjoyed that. What did you think?
Gotta say, I had my mind blown by Carl. I think, what a great guy, absolute expert in this field, but also brings a lot to the table that you as listeners probably haven't had before or heard before. I know I hadn't, and I think you'll really enjoy listening to it. So hope you enjoy the podcast.
Let's talk to Carl. Carl, thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Really pleasure to be here and to have a chat with you guys today.
We're so excited. So Carl, we start every show with a question to our guest. Who are you? Where do you come from? What are you doing right now? So tell us a little bit about Carl Osbourne.
Well, before I start, I've got to ask you, where do you think I'm from? Because this one comes up a lot. I'm obviously not from the United States, but where do you think I'm from?
I was gonna say Alabama. No, are you Irish?
How about you, Michael? What are you guessing?
I can't tell if you're from New Zealand or Australia.
Exactly. That's what everyone always says. I'm from England. I'm from half an hour north of London.
You know what? It's the shirt. It's
Is
the
that what
shirt
it is?
in the bleached blonde tips.
Well, it's the pale skin. I tan in the midnight around January over here in Southern California, which is where I'm based now. But yeah, I'm from England originally, Dan. I spent about 7 years or so over here in Southern California, but it's my second stint over here. I was when I was 25, I was working in a central strategy team of BP, and my boss said to me, if you ever want to run one of these retail businesses, you've got to get some operational experience. Do you want to go to Krakow in Poland or San Diego in California? And for a young single guy with this accent, I was like, yeah, all right, guys, I'll take the San Diego ticket. And I had a great 3.5 years over there, and that's where I ended up meeting my wife. And we came back to Europe for 8 years, and then ultimately I came back in 2015 to run that retail business. Right, so it was fun how that kind of played out. But hopefully the accent stays. My career story in a nutshell, Dan, is I spent 18 years in the C-store world, right? So a lot of my background's in gas stations, convenience stores, everything attributed to that line of work. And in many ways, I had a big pivot in 2018 when I left and went to Kitchen United in the ghost kitchen world. And my co-author, Meredith, was working there as the COO, and I met up with her initially to ask her, well, what's it like to leave a company of that size? Where she came from Yum Brands, obviously me from BP, and to go into a startup environment. And I was thinking, is it easy to do? And she made me feel a little bit more comfortable about it. And then she started talking about these ghost kitchen things that she was building at Kitchen United. I was like, well, that sounds pretty interesting as well. What the heck's a ghost kitchen? And of course, we can talk more about that in a moment. But I ended up running a lot of the operations over at Kitchen United, building out the operating model. And there, of course, this was all before the pandemic, before restaurants were really embracing off-premise fully, before they really understood what ghost kitchens were. And I said to Meredith at the time, I said, wouldn't it be great if we could get our prospects, our current customers, a book to tell them about why this digitization is something to take seriously, why they should be excited about the future of off-premise, and why they shouldn't think of it as something that is being driven by the venture capitalists or the technology companies. And actually, it's the consumer that has this thirst for extra levels of convenience. And she said, great, Carl, go get the book on Amazon. And of course, I looked on Amazon for the book and it didn't exist. And so it was only after we left Kitchen United that we ended up writing the first book, which here it is, Delivering the Digital Restaurant, Your Roadmap to the Future of Food. Came out in the summer of 21, so right in the middle of the pandemic. Every restaurant's now a ghost kitchen. Every restaurant's now having to embrace off-premise. So it couldn't have been better timed. It won a bunch of awards, became a bestseller in a few different countries. Really was, for me personally, a wonderful rebranded exercise, right? From being the oil and gas C-store guy to now, people being someone that's been invited to conferences to talk about the future for restaurants. And yeah, it was great. And that actually is what led to a number of advisory board roles for restaurants, technology platforms across the ecosystem. I sit on a restaurant group at the board of a company called AlphaCo in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, and see behind the curtain of how restaurants run their business beyond just technology and off-premise. And it was also the book that really led me to my co-founders, who were coming in from the travel and hospitality sector, and had read the book and were interested in what was happening in the restaurant industry. And they had this idea around data-driven pricing with Juicer. And I said, guys, that makes so much sense. There's so many things that we can learn from travel and hospitality sector in the restaurant industry. How can I help? And so then I was one of the 4 co-founders of that company, been doing that for the last 18 months. And in the last 2 months, the latest book has come up. I know this is a long answer to your question, Dan. Hey, you asked the question. Delivering the Digital Restaurant, The Path to Digital Maturity is the second book that came out a few months ago. And this is more of a how to the first book's why, more of a playbook, if you will, as to how restaurants need to look at off-premise, how they can, digitize themselves in an appropriate manner at an appropriate pace. So that's me in a nutshell.
It's a big nutshell. Super impressive. Love the whole
awesome
breakdown. I have so many follow-up questions, but I guess my first one is, what was it like to write a book, A? B, what was it like to write a book with another person? And C, do you have any advice for folks that are in a similar position like you and want to write a book or want to get a white paper out there, something like that? Talk through that process. Now you've done it twice.
Great questions. It's a very much a arduous task. In many ways it's a thankless task, because there's always lots to write about, but you never really know whether something is going to fit and sit with people correctly. And so for us, we were in the fortunate position of writing the book during the early days of the pandemic. And therefore we had 100 or so industry executives, both on restaurants and on the technology side, that were sitting at home, like what the rest of us were, available to talk about themselves and their companies and talk about their journey. So in a way, it was a great privilege to have the pandemic going on. It also helps if you run into writer's block, because you can't leave your house, right? You just got to keep on writing. In that same sense, it was very helpful to write a book with Meredith as well, because Meredith is one of the smartest women I know. She's fantastic. I mean, clearly really rich with her background in the restaurant space, but also very different in her style. I'm more the project manager. She's more the purist. And so between the two of us, we really were able to have a blend of the kind of art and science of writing in one. And I think that really worked quite nicely. And so it helps when you run into those days of asking yourself, should I really do this? Is this really worthwhile? And so we motivated each other in various different ways. And then to the third part of your question about what if others are thinking about writing a book? Our joke answer is don't. But the way in which we try to say to folks is just start writing, put stuff out for free on Medium, put it out on LinkedIn, see what resonates, see what really sticks with people, see what gets people talking. And that is always a great indication, of your style and the content and the types of things that people are interested in reading. So just start writing. And then from that, you might often find that a series of different blog articles that you've written may end up being the first few chapters of your next book.
I love that. So you very explicitly did not come from restaurants, and you went into sort of restaurant adjacent or restaurant embracing technology, and now you're the COO of Juicer, which is explicitly focused on restaurants. As an operator, as someone who feels an immense need to see change in our industry, and yet has a bit of resistance to outsiders, I'm just interested to understand, what drove the decision to get into restaurants? And was it just, it seemed fun, you wanted to work with Meredith? Do you think that there's worlds where folks from within the industry can change as dramatically and as drastically as, the sort of ideal disruption of a ghost kitchen, or does it have to come from the outside?
Another good question. The thing for me is I've always been a multi-unit retail player. And so whether you're selling a Snickers bar or whether you're selling a steak Diane or something, for me, you're selling a product, you're selling a service, and you're trying to actually give someone an experience of sorts. Now, the thing about restaurants that attracted me was that it is far more than just a product. I mean, you think about your favorite restaurant experience of your life. Most of the time people will, for sure, they'll talk about the food, but they'll talk about the experience that surrounded the food. And most of the time that kind of resonates for me in more of the smaller, more independent restaurants that perhaps we grew up enjoying, right? And in many ways, a lot of that is the genesis behind the book as well. The fact that this is so challenging around off-premise and technology, which many people didn't get into restaurants because they like technology, right? In many ways, they want to see the smiles on their guests' faces. They want to see how the food is resonating with them. And technology doesn't always really help them in that regard. And so in a way, it requires outsiders to be able to say, what if? It requires outsiders at times to poke the bear, if you will, to be able to say, what if you look at it from this angle and this perspective? And ultimately, I think it's always helpful to bring someone from the outside in to give you a different perspective. I'm sure each of you guys see it in your organizations, no matter whether it's someone that's come from the same industry. Someone can come, one of my jobs was running a finance team before. I've never, I don't even like math, but, I was managing a whole bunch of accountants, helping a, multi-hundred million pound in the UK retail business. And because I came from a different perspective without having a financial background, I was able to bring a completely new perspective to that team and the way they went about it. And so in many ways, it takes a little bit of courage to put yourself outside of that comfort zone and to go into the spaces where you're not necessarily as comfortable. But also, there's a huge amount of value for you to bring to the table. And that can be from industry standpoint, from skill sets, function that you're supporting. And I was super, super surprised when I left a company the size of BP and the C-store space and came into a ghost kitchen environment, in a startup environment, and actually realized how much value I could bring to the table from all the things that I had experienced up to that point. So for those people that are thinking about career jumps in those different directions, in many ways, I say go for it, because you'll be surprised at how much value you've really got to bring. And in terms of the ghost kitchen piece, look, ultimately, ghost kitchens are still evolving. I was just commenting on a post on LinkedIn earlier today where someone was referencing something about virtual brands and how virtual brands are dying, and that was always going to be the case. And I made a comment about the penny farthing bicycle, right? That was a bad bike, guys, right? You remember that big bike with the big, the big wheel at the front and the small at the back? I mean, that's a bad bike. Well, that might be the virtual brands of where we are today. But we've also got 180, 200 years later, these amazing electric bikes that are taking us up hills at rapid paces without having to, pedal. So it tells you that you can evolve things, and they are there to play a role. But it's about how fast you can evolve, how fast you can learn. And I think that applies to products and features as it does to each of us as individuals as well.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I'll just, I feel like when we do these podcasts, sometimes I'm first to talk, so I want to make sure Mike gets a chance to ask some questions. But my view on ghost kitchens is there's obvious evidence that consumers wanted engaged digitally. There's also a lot of evidence that Domino's did it in the 70s when they launched these satellite kitchens. So it wasn't necessarily a new concept. And I think Domino's 10 years ago was at the forefront of embracing technology and being an off-premise first brand. Where I still find there's kind of more meat left on the bone is it's really hard to create a brand that people have an emotional connection to if it's digital only. And I think we've seen that with the proliferation of cloud kitchens, Kitchen United, Reef. Even if there's an existing sort of chef behind it, it's really hard to build up that consistency and that love. Even if people are ordering it digitally, unless you've built another ecosystem of a brand around it, it doesn't resonate. And when you can smell that it's a boardroom brand, when you can tell that it's a cheesy knockoff, it's almost immediately distasteful for most folks, regardless of price point, regardless of offering. And so, with Square Pie Guys, we started as a pop-up. So like the early days were smoke, like we were in a wine bar that didn't have ventilation. The smoke would like fill out in the street. People would come in off. We opened a restaurant. We opened a dine-in restaurant, but we opened from day one with online ordering, and we had third-party delivery fees built into our pro forma. So we were always all about every possible channel we could have. When COVID hit, we became a delivery-only kitchen. We became, I like to say, the prettiest ghost kitchen in all of San Francisco, because it was a gorgeous build-out that we just closed the doors off, and the drivers got their food through an acrylic panel. And so I saw firsthand how important off-premise is for a brand. And we actually gained a lot of new guests through the pandemic, through DoorDash. Like people were like, oh, I've never been to your restaurant. I didn't even know you had seats inside. I'm like, well, that sucks, but also I'm glad you're buying from us. I guess I'd love to hear, Mike, Carl, how do we bridge that gap? Like, how do we take that penny bicycle and make it the electric bike, or even make it just like a bike with wheels that are the same size, where guests can have that emotional connection, but we have some of those economic realities and I guess preferential operating conditions that come from the ghost kitchen?
Totally. Like, I mean, first of all, we need to separate ghost kitchens from virtual brands, right? So ghost kitchens are the hardware, virtual brands are the software. They are separate entities. And so you can have a very well-established brand operating out of a ghost kitchen. You can have a virtual brand operating out of a current brick and mortar restaurant. And so it's important that the two are distinguished, because both of them have a different case to answer for in many ways. But your point is well made, Dan. I think for me, the challenge that ghost kitchens and virtual brands have run into is that they seem very lucrative from an economic standpoint. They're almost oversold with that promise, and everyone thinks, well, this is great. Now I can test the idea that I've always wanted to test and put it into this ghost kitchen and not have this 7-figure outlay to see whether it's going to work or not. But that's not the reality, because everything you said is absolutely right. It's the fact that you still have to bring customers to your virtual door. And if you haven't got the wherewithal to be able to invest in the digital marketing and the capabilities to do that well, then you will struggle. And you'll struggle in a brick and mortar in the same way as you'd struggle in a ghost kitchen. And so oftentimes, I would argue, ghost kitchens get a bit of a bad rap because actually the tenant of the ghost kitchen, regardless of the model, hasn't sufficiently invested in their model to be able to attract appropriate amount of customers to the door. Now, even if you were to take a 3 million AUV restaurant and say, well, how much are you doing today off-premise? And even if they're doing 1 million, right? That 1 million is what you're talking about in a ghost kitchen setup. So you've got to therefore make it work, the economics off that 1 million, and recognize how are you going to be able to drive that level of revenue into your brand. But there are folks out there doing it. The one I particularly like talking about a lot right now is Slutty Vegan.
Yeah.
Right? And why does that work? Why does that work? Slutty Vegan works because A, it's kind of risque. B, it's very characterful. It's got an impactful, engaging brand where everything is talked about online. In fact, Pinky Cole was at the National Restaurant Show a few weeks back saying that by 2030, every restaurant will be a ghost kitchen. Now, I don't necessarily subscribe to that view, but the point is that when you've got people that are coming from the outside again, don't forget, she was a producer for the Today Show, I think it was, or some daytime, primetime show, that bring a different perspective, but know and get digital marketing and digital engagement. You can create what she had in her recent Dallas opening, which was people queuing around the block to be able to try out their first Slutty Vegan in Texas. So I think it's just an evolution of helping the right operators understand the right model for them. In fact, in my latest book, The Path to Digital Maturity, we give different breakdowns of different types of virtual brands and different ghost kitchen models, because there are lots of different models out there. And the right model might not be the right one for you if you haven't appropriately understood where your strengths lie.
Love that.
Okay. I think we're gonna have to do 2 podcasts, man, because I've just been like slowly typing away questions for Carl the whole time. All right. So, but on that vein, Carl, and this might be a controversial question, but I think it would be a fun one. So what do you think, knowing what you know now or knowing what we know now, if you were to be able to go back and append your first book, anything in that first book, would you? Is there anything in there that you would have changed where people can read them? And the second part of that question is, what did the techies and the PE, private equity investors, and everyone who really got involved in this ghost kitchen explosion right over the last, let's say, 2 years, what did they miss or underestimate in the challenge of just having a food and beverage concept or service in general, which if they went back, we could do? What would you have done differently with all that investor money to be at a place of more maturity or farther along as a ghost kitchen concept than we are today? Because I feel like we had one iteration, we kind of fell off, and now we're coming back. But it's because the food and beverage people are starting to get involved, which is why I really liked what you said about not having any economics or finance degree and getting involved with pricing models.
Yeah. The first book, I love the question. The thing that is interesting is that sometimes for those of us that are right at the center of talking about this stuff, and I go to all the big industry conferences, one of the things I remind folks on is like the average restaurant operator isn't where you think they are today, and we actually still need to let them play catch up. And there were some folks at the National Restaurant Show recently saying, well, I didn't see much innovation, I didn't see much new technology. And I said, that's great, because the technology needs to slow down. We need to allow restaurants to play a bit of catch up here. They're just coming out of the most turbulent period of their history with the pandemic and the labor crisis. So my goodness, do they now need to take stock of where they're at to be able to see where we're going. So in a way, the first book is as relevant today as it was 2 years ago, ironically. That the conditions of emergency and spray and pray, deployment of technology is not necessarily as pressing today as perhaps what it was in the throes of the pandemic. But there are a few things would have changed. We probably would have changed the ghost kitchen chapter. We would have probably changed and we often say that because that is the area we're most familiar with. And in a way, we could have probably written another couple of chapters around it, but it was right at the beginning of where things were. And at that point, there were so many different models. We tried to address it in the second book by discussing these different models. And then I think there's something there about thinking about the automation aspect that we would have included. I think if you look at where restaurants are investing money today, a lot of it's around back of house efficiency. That doesn't mean robotic arms necessarily, but it does certainly mean things like smart ovens and
IoT, food safety.
Yep. All that kind of stuff. That's getting a lot of attention this year. So I think there could have probably been a bit more around that. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see if we ever get around to a third book. Meredith doesn't like the idea of a third book, but hey, which you always need a trilogy, right? Maybe I'm trying to suggest we need a board game, but hey, we'll see. To your second point about investors in the space
and techies, like what did the big money guys miss when they saw this great opportunity? Like, oh great, let's throw money in the food business, and this, the EBITDA on this looks incredible, and we'll have all the best brands super quick, online ordering, because that raised a lot of capital.
Well, venture capital is always a bit of a it's always the odds of getting a win is always tough, right? So in a sense, you invest with where you see the tide moving. And I think in that sense, investors having put money into this space in general, we're seeing a rise in off-premise food, seeing a rise in customers wanting to eat food outside of the restaurant. And you could argue, I would suggest, that bet is actually well placed, not just because of the pandemic, but actually the fact that we are getting to a place now where maybe 20-30% of the average restaurant sales mix is going to be off-premise. So the macro picture has actually been landed pretty well, I would argue, from the average investor. The challenge is where they've decided to put their money into which types of technology and which ventures, right? And so then a lot of it comes down to the individuals. I mean, most VCs that I know invest in the founders, they invest in the people, they invest in their ability to pivot, right? And so I think that is always a thing. And then look, in many ways, we know the investor money is drying up out there, as to where we sit today here in June 2023. But in many ways, I think that's a good thing, because actually it's creating us all to have to run proper businesses.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't tell you guys the amount of parties I went to from companies that still weren't making a penny, but were hiring out, the suites in the top of some Vegas hotel somewhere to try and bring customers in. And
not naming any names.
Not naming any names, but I'm sure we've all been to them.
I mean, it's been a frothy couple of years, right? Like there's just been so much money pumped into the space. I mean, two of the biggest IPOs in the last couple of years from food tech were companies that are still not profitable and don't have a clear path towards profitability. There's a sort of idea of like with scale comes profit. But I think if your base model has misunderstood the unit economics, scale doesn't get you anywhere, right? Like if it actually costs $25 to deliver a pizza in San Francisco all in, and you're only charging your consumers in the restaurant $20, you're never going to get to the scale where that makes sense. If anything, scale accelerates the lack of economics. So I do think there's a level of, I'm sure for a lot of restaurant operators, the ones that are savvy enough to see the analogs and get frustrated, there could be some consternation. It's like, oh, this person got $100 million to run a company that can never make a profit. I'm running this little shop and scraping out 5%, and that's a good year. I find that fascinating, and I think we spoke to the CEO and founder of Thanks, and
Zach.
Zach's a great guy.
All right.
He's okay. No, he's good. He's good.
One of the smartest people I know.
Totally.
Yeah. No, we were just kind of, and then he just spoke, and it was a great interview.
One of the most eloquent speakers I've ever met or talked to as well.
One of the things we talked about was sort of the actual economic model of running a software company, even if it's focused on the food service side. And it's fascinating. So I don't know if you can share any of that with Juicer. Obviously Juicer is one of 2 or 3 sort of first to market solutions for dynamic pricing. I know Chally just stood up a product because their model basically no longer exists, with the point of sales cutting them out.
Well, they're partnering with Sauce. So Sauce is like a parallel.
Sauce and Juicer, and Sauce actually pitched us at Square Pie Guys before they had a Toast integration and a functional DoorDash integration. I said, with all due respect, that doesn't do anything for us. So there is something to be learned. I think when you're selling into restaurants, the technology has to actually do what it's supposed to do, and it has to make the operator's job easier. So if it's not there yet, I understand trying to get customers, but don't sell to restaurants unless you're actually able to do it.
Let me address.
We need a response on that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to address a couple of things, because it ties to what you were saying before as well with regards to the investment money.
Yeah.
So in a way, part of the challenge of all the investment money that's come into our environment has led to a huge amount of pressure on the shoulders of the sales folks for these restaurant technology companies.
Mm-hmm.
And those expectations has led to a lot of over-promising and under-delivering, which, guess what, has created a greater sense of distrust in restaurant technology companies already.
Yeah.
So in a sense, running proper companies, running more orientated companies that are trying to build a business model that works for their clients and for themselves, I think is super, super important. And it's something with that Juicer that Ashwin and myself and my co-founders, we're certainly trying to build the company in a transparent light. Because when you talk about price, my goodness, can it be the most sensitive thing? When I was managing gas prices for BP in the UK, it was the most political job of my career, because everyone's got a view on gas prices. And it's one of those things that, because of the fine margins you're talking about in the restaurant industry, you have to be able to be a trustworthy entity. So we very much are building the company in public, which at times might seem incredibly naive, because obviously our competitors can hear about what we're doing, and you can perhaps build challenges around how we're operating ourselves. But we think if we do that, we'll earn the trust from restaurants and other entrepreneurs that are building their business as a result. And we're also trying to build the business in, I don't know whether you've heard of this term, headless commerce, but I think it was a term that was first coined by Salesforce. And what that means is, for all intents and purposes, imagine like a Chrome plugin or an app on the App Store. It's not everything. You don't need to have it so that it requires huge levels of change on the technology stack that you're building. Because, quite honestly, again, restaurants are so tired of having to pick restaurant solutions, right? In the second book, we talk about the 15 to 20 different technology solutions they're already using. And it only takes 5 minutes in the conference hall for you to be able to walk around and try to figure out, well, what do you do? And then you've got these other folks over there saying they're an all-in-one solution. It's incredibly complex. So your point about simplicity, Dan, I think is so well put, and I understand it completely, because what we try to do with Juicer is say, how do you price today? Is it as good as you could potentially price? And I haven't met one restaurant owner or operator, whether it be a big executive of a big chain or an independent, that said, no, we could certainly price better than what we do today. And most folks use a cost plus approach, right? And then they have a view on what the competitors are doing. And then as the costs increase, they adjust and do a blanket price increase once, twice, maybe 3 times a year. And what we're saying is, well, what if you use data science and more data to be able to make a more informed decision? And then what if you were to set constraints around your prices, so that way you feel comfortable that at no point in time your price is ever out of kilter? Taylor Swift is the biggest enemy of what we're trying to do at Juicer. Why do I say that? Well, because of the surge pricing associated to Taylor's concerts, right? Or the Uber surge pricing. Or it's not a week goes by where you don't see someone say, well, look at this natural disaster and look how the hotel prices have changed their thing, or the bottles of water that have changed their prices. What we're trying to do is set very clear constraints so that a restaurant says, I want my prices never moving beyond -5% and +15%. And then the optimization and the data science operates within those boundaries. Similarly, we ask our restaurants, who are your main competitors? And they might say, well, I've got this competitor over here, and it's their cheeseburger that I want you to monitor. And so therefore, and we say, well, do you want to be at the same price, $1 cheaper, $1 more? And we set the constraints around that. So the constraints are super important to allow the optimization to take effect. And I think if you approach it delicately, and so even if we were to use that 15% range, we would spend the first couple of months perhaps operating in the first 5% of the range, and would do that to make sure we don't lose a restaurant's customer. Because we all know you've worked super hard to get that customer, and if you lose that customer, how is it? It's not easy to get them back. And by testing it in a very slow, gradual fashion, you end up creating a situation where you don't lose any volume, you don't create any negative guest sentiment, and you optimize on the edges. And over time, what we think is going to happen is we're going to empower restaurant guests to be able to know that if they order an hour earlier, let's say at 5 p.m., they can get a good deal. And now at 7 p.m. on a Friday night, the restaurant no longer needs to throttle their orders because they're too busy, because actually they're now able to increase the price by 50 cents. And therefore, those value-conscious customers are still going to be able to have the choice to make that 50 cents investment to still get their food. But it's also going to balance out the operational throughput challenge, which again, we haven't touched on yet, but that's a big one for restaurants, to be able to then say, how do you smooth these things out? How do you smooth the available capacity and the throughput rate out appropriately? And then I think this builds into things like promotional optimization. We're trying to position ourselves as e-commerce optimizers. My co-founders have built dynamic pricing companies in hotels. They've been e-commerce loyalty players. Our chairman was the former CMO and founding CMO of Kayak, and was the former CEO of Jetsetter. So these guys have been there, done it, and they know how these things play. And so I think with that delicate, that constraint-based approach, I think we're trying to build a company that's responsible and trustworthy. And, we don't want to be the penny farthing, clearly, but we are trying to evolve at the pace that restaurants are willing to evolve, and ultimately build something that's going to help restaurants make more money, because they need to. It's a very slim margin game.
Hey, Daniel, can I ask a question? Because I want to follow this up, and then I really want you to tell because me and Danny had a great 45-minute long conversation about this, and I'm so happy that we have somebody who has that view, right? Like, and again, I think it's more hospitality oriented, because I'm doing, I've been focused for 12 years on sales to the industry, selling technology, but my view being a restaurant hotel guy my entire life, and jumping because I saw this opportunity to make their lives easier, is to get a thank you. It's not to get it's like, look, you'd want to thank you. And Danny has this great line he brought up yesterday, like a no now is better than an I'm sorry in 10 minutes, or a returned invoice, or just a mistake. But on that vein, doing what you're doing, I'd love to just get a sense of, you said you don't have the financial background. You don't have a degree. You're working with guys who really do that. What you do bring to the table into a company, it sounds like, is process and trust and some of those things. Maybe there's a couple more. How are you contributing to this mindset in view via testing, making sure not to lose clients? What are you bringing to the table for these other partners that may have built Kayak and done these other things? What for you is, if you weren't there, this is what the impact would be?
It would crumble into pieces. No, I'm joking.
Oh yeah, man.
Now we're gonna get Osbourne on and ask him the same question.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think in many ways it's the blend of us all together that really works nicely, because Ashwin and I are pretty much the full-time co-founders, right? Yeah. So we're very much driving, and Ashwin brings his e-commerce background, and I think I bring a lot of the background attributed to how restaurants are feeling, and the network, quite honestly, that I have within this space. And so the integrity and building that trust, I think, is something that very much comes in the conversations that I have. Similarly, the fact that we believe in partnerships, the fact that we could see this solution being something which is a white label solution, right? So whether it be something ultimately that Olo has a dynamic pricing or feature function, it could be powered by us for all we care, and we don't necessarily need it to be something that is a separate entity. And so in that sense, the business development is my kind of main area of focus. The partnership is my kind of area of focus. The operating model, the commercialization of this business is very much my focus. And it's also the generalized aspect. A lot of my career has been spent doing a variety of different roles, whether it be project management through to pricing, through to managing finance teams, through to, operating ghost kitchens and being in the dish pit. So I've done a whole bunch of different things like that, which actually means I have an appreciation of just the wider operating functionality of how to run a business.
It also sounds like people too.
Yeah,
like
totally.
you have like it's obvious, a very high emotional intelligence. You can put yourself in the operator's shoes, the people's shoes, and probably building the network you've built with such integrity and knowing you can deliver. I think that would be something that people could come away from this conversation is, how do you implement a testing strategy to get your customer that you want to thank you from there, right? By setting expectations that you're agreeing in partnership, we're going to get two together. But it also keeps you from saying this is going to be an all-in-one best case. You're going to be at a 3-to-1 return on investment, 90 days. It's like you can say that, but you have a whole team behind you. You're relying to deliver that outcome on. What would you tell technologies, founders, salespeople? What's just a quick, at least do this, whether it's a Rossi matrix, or how can you create a mutual success plan?
What I think, if I was speaking, and I do actually do a number of talks to other restaurant technology companies in their internal conferences and speak to them. And one of the things I often will say is, remember that phrase about keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. If you were to think about your own organization today and what you offer, how do you differentiate yourselves from the others that are out there? I cannot tell you the amount of times I've walked again across those conference floors and gone to see, I don't know, pick one, a first party ordering platform, and then say, okay, so, your lunchbox. And then I go to a Spot On group and I say, okay, Spot On group, tell me the differences between you and lunchbox. And I pick those two, not for any particular reason, but you get my point. And whether it be one or the other, I would say, well, tell me about how you differentiate yourselves from the others. And I get very different answers each time. And I think that means we need to be more educated about what options are available out there. And I think we need to get better at saying no to restaurants when we're not the right fit. Nico over at POS, he says, I'm spending more of my time now saying no to potential customers than actually trying to bring customers on board, because he wants to have his technology be the perfect fit for his clients. Totally. And that ultimately is really important, because then you don't get the churn. Then you don't get the over-promising and under-delivering. Then you don't put the excessive pressure on the product teams to have to modify your product to fit the customers. So I think it's about setting expectations for yourself and your company and understanding the competitive environment out there.
The amount of resources, time, bandwidth, and effort that go into the I'm sorry 10 minutes later is, that sinks technology companies, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the technology companies that aren't able to do competitive analysis. I mean, I was on a pitch call 2 days ago with someone who's rolling out supposedly the best new mobile ordering platform. And all they could say was, it's better than everyone else. And I said, why is it better than Lunchbox? Why is it better than Olo? Like, I haven't looked at any of those. Like, what are you doing if you're not able to sort of articulate exactly why you are the best version? If you're going to say you're the best version, you better be able to defend exactly why that is. I'd be interested to understand for Cube, who's their ideal customer and who are they saying no to, if you are aware of that?
Fast casual QSRs are typically their focus, right? And of a certain unit size. But you'll have to ask them to get more into the specifics of it. But that's very much their focus at a certain volume of locations.
What about same question for Juicer? I'd really like to know who shouldn't look at it. Like who's not ready for it, or who shouldn't spend their time there if they got other things to focus on and do work for.
So there's so many different ways. So I'll answer the Juicy question, but the second
maybe
book,
just that one.
The second book is about helping restaurants figure out where to focus and deploy their resources. Right? The idea of the path to digital maturity is to say, all right, breathe, find where you're at. This is what we think is the path to digital maturity. Dedicate your resource, whether it be your time, certainly your money, and your deployment of procurement practices into getting good at this area. And that could be third-party optimization, right? And it could be first-party ordering, selection, and design. And we think 70-80% of restaurants are still in those two.
Right.
When it comes to juicer and data-driven pricing, in many ways, if you haven't got a first-party ordering platform, I would think, well, are you digitally mature enough to start thinking about how data science can influence the way in which you price? Now, we could just price their third parties, for sure we could. But I think there's something about helping restaurants have that level of focus. And so for me, our area is actually certainly trying to support more digitally mature chains, typically of about 20 units or more, but probably 20 to 200 units, ideally corporate owned, because it's a faster decision-making process. And so what we would look to do is we'd take something like 10% of their network, deploy a pilot for that network over the course of 6 months, demonstrate them the uplift on a test versus control basis, and from there be able to expand out. And ultimately, I'm trying to build it so we get to a place where the restaurant is a complete believer that there's any potential wrinkle in us understanding the commercial case can be ironed out through that period. Now that if we were like a highly leveraged investment, with investors that had come from the VC world into us, that timeline might be more difficult. They might be saying, no, we want the results now, get the results now, so therefore you can expand out faster.
Right.
But this gentle approach, I think, is the more prudent approach to be able to get restaurants on board, and then those more digitally mature restaurant groups will be the vocal champions of us ultimately into the rest of the industry. But here's the other thing which we haven't touched on. We also have a big team of people that are manually making the price changes. We're a full service pricing company. So what that means is not only are we doing the analytics and making the pricing strategy recommendations, we're also deploying the price changes themselves. Danny mentioned earlier about the fact restaurants don't have enough time and that whole piece of it. So we're saying, well, look, we'll take this all away from you. We'll actually deploy it. And even if we don't have a technology integration in place, we'll log in into your system. We'll actually make the price changes. We'll have an audit team to make sure those price changes are correctly implemented. And therefore, the restaurant, all they have to do is hand us the keys and get us access to their POS transactional data for us to be able to make it easy and to help them. And I think it's that piece about making it easy that's so important. Most of the challenges that exist in our space today are attributed to the fact that it's so difficult to get one bit of technology to work with another piece of technology. And you go speak to any of my POS friends, and they'll all say, well, we're trying to fix the basic things that our biggest customers, our biggest restaurant chains wants us to fix, which might mean how to more effectively add a menu item to the menu chain, right? It was nothing to do with data-driven pricing, for goodness sake. That kind of stuff sounds good to them, but they're saying, yeah, well, maybe a year, 18 months down the line. So again, we've built this business so that it can operate regardless of technology interfaces. And that really is, resonating well for restaurants.
That's huge.
Have you gone through one of these 6-month or 3-month periods where so just to be clear, Juicer is optimizing revenue?
Yep.
Have you seen a world where you couldn't optimize revenue, like the model wasn't where you wanted it to be? And I assume if that happened, you've made some changes since then. And B, have you gotten feedback like, yeah, our revenue is better, but our margins are actually worse as a result? Like we drove too many of the lower cost sales and it blew our prime costs out of the water. Have you seen that? Is that something that y'all take into account with the data science or?
Yeah, so we ask for where possible to get a margin product lens, right? So that way we understand which products are clearly going to be higher margin products. We haven't got to a situation where we've run into any particular issues attributed to what we've done because of that gentle approach I mentioned earlier.
Right.
So again, if we are able to gently deploy price increases, which we're talking nickels and dimes here, guys, right? We're not talking dollars, nickels and dimes to be able to see if I increase this by 20 cents, do I see a demonstrable volume decrease? That should concern me. Now, part of the problem here is you need to have a certain amount of transactions. Clearly, if a particular product sells at 100 items per hour on a Friday night versus a particular product selling 10 items on that hour, the former item is going to get me to my learnings 10 times faster than the first, right? I'm going to get to a statistically relevant result much sooner. So part of this is about not jumping to conclusions too soon. And part of it is about understanding where there is something happening at the restaurant level that's got nothing to do with price. And so that requires an open communication channel with the restaurant to understand what's going on, sometimes not even in the test locations, but in the control locations. I was just on a call earlier today about this, where we were recognizing that our control location shut last month. And so no wonder why we were seeing different results, right? So again, that trust and integrity piece of it's so important, so that we can actually say, we're not going to claim the upside of things that are not anything to do with us. And so, we believe that depending on what the restaurant's objectives are, that when you are increasing prices, you actually increase in margin as well, because the customer is already coming to you. And so therefore, if they were coming to you anyway, and now they're paying that extra 20, 30 cents, that's 20, 30 cents incremental margin.
Could I ask, just maybe for the audience and just in general, because Danny, you and I were having this chat when we were talking, and I was trying to record. We did a couple test recordings on the computer while I was driving in cars, just to hear how our voices sound.
See if we could have some chemistry, which turns out.
Yeah, we're okay. So can you just define, like, what are some of the misconceptions about dynamic pricing, specifically to the difference between discounting and dynamic pricing?
Yeah. Carl, you want to go?
And also, Carl, let us know if you have a hard stop. And I like, just from both sides, because the pizza story, Danny, I always think about how that worked, and then how do you apply that one case. But Carl, take that one.
Yes, and I do have a hard stop at 5. But the one thing I'll say is that discounting is only, when you're talking about dynamic pricing, as I prefer calling it data-driven pricing because of the Taylor Swift thing I mentioned earlier. The thing you've got to remember is, if you're going to discount your price, you've got to make sure you're not cannibalizing your margins.
Yeah.
Because of exactly what I just mentioned a moment ago. The customer is already on your digital front door. They're making a decision as to what to purchase. So if you're discounting, sometimes you might discount to be able to get to a place to be able to grow your tray value, right? So maybe I will keep my entree price as the current price, but I might reduce the price of a drink. So that way I know that typically drinks aren't purchased with this entree. So therefore I have a slightly cheaper drink price. Maybe I'll attach that and increase the attachment rate of that drink to the entree. That can work. But if you're going to do blanket decreases, blanket discounts across certain items at certain times of day, you've got to have a promotional mechanic to communicate that to your customers. Almost, the equivalent of, how do you have a tent card saying happy hour? And for some, it might be the email. For some, it might be the text message. For some, it might be the push notification on the app. It could be the geofence notification saying, "Oh, come in now because these items are this much cheaper than usual." If you don't have that, you're running the risk of potentially just giving that margin away for a customer that was already coming to you. So you have to balance it out very carefully.
You and Zach from Thanks must have had a great guy, because I loved his take on this too, which was value add, right? There's a give and get, right? We want you in here because you've never been in here before. We're willing to do this for you to get you to become a customer, or because we want you to try something new, we're going to give this incentive to do that, or not just this blanket loyalty or this blanket discounting, because then it's like, okay, well, 5 p.m. let's just check the dynamic pricing app and see who has the cheapest burger today. And sure, that works for some. But again, if you're either starting out or you're mid-sized brand trying to grow, I think you're exactly right. I mean, if you're discounting before the customers ask for it, and they're some of your loyal, you don't want to discount your loyal customers who want to support you anyway.
Right. But I think this is about empowering the guest, right?
Yeah,
this is about empowering the guest to be able to be knowledgeable that actually you can get value if you're willing to either order ahead, because that could be one way of offering some value. So that way you can prep the kitchen in some way that you've actually got. Or potentially just moving it to the shoulder hour, just to the hour before. And then it's about understanding your guests' purchase behaviors. You just need to look at any of the big loyalty players out there that are saying, well, this customer typically purchases from this restaurant on Tuesdays at, Tuesday afternoons. And so therefore, well, then let's, intelligently prompt that customer to know that if they order an hour earlier, they're able to get some value. But if you know that customer isn't typically drawn to the value-orientated items in your menu, then why bother with that message? Actually, they might be more drawn to the latest LTO, or being able to, as one of Zach's favorite phrases I hear him say is like, treat your top 1% to the McRib year round, or invite them to the LTO testing and get their opinions. That kind of stuff counts. And that's why loyalty is changing like crazy these days. And it's got to be far more than the punch-based systems.
I just, that one thing, Danny, I just wanted to say, because I know you want to get in here too, and we have a 5 o'clock stop. I never look at it from a process operational standpoint. Moving 5% of your guests 30 minutes later, 30 minutes earlier could have huge impacts on quality, on, you know, the stress of the kitchen, everything, you know, what you're able to make. And
across all
that I've
channels.
never thought about.
Across all channels, that's the thing, you know. It's also so many restaurants are throttling themselves and forgetting to unthrottle themselves, and therefore missing out on a whole bunch of orders. It's a real unknown problem. But when I speak to my friends over at Uber and DoorDash, it's amazing how much of a problem that really is. We've made it so easy to throttle, we've forgotten that it's important to turn it back up.
Yeah. Well, that was actually, I think, when Mike and I spoke about this exact issue, that was one of the examples I brought up. So Square Pie Guys, 3 ovens, 90 pizzas per hour. That's the max. That's it. COVID Friday, a lot more pizzas than that came in. And so it became the inevitable throttling, you know, hour and a half, 2 hours. So we basically pegged the throttle from 5 p.m. on until 7 or 8 when things started to clear up on the board. And so dynamic pricing for me was the way to solve that. So it seems like there's some alignment there. I guess I'd love to understand, is there a fear of the guest embracing it too well to where you've basically trained your most loyal guests or your predictable guests to appreciate that value? So now you've gotten a guest that's addicted to those cheaper meal periods, and you have to figure out ways to get them back to the higher price point. And do you have evidence? I mean, you know, for me, I have a hard time seeing how nickels and dimes are going to sway consumer behavior. Obviously, that's an example, not the exact amount, but for a $25 pizza, taking a dime off of it is not going to do much, in my opinion, to sway consumer behavior. So how do you sort of meter those out, and how do you test really if it has an effect on consumer behavior?
Well, the nickels and dimes are more about the approach on edging up the price. So if you've got a $10 product and you were to switch it tomorrow to $20, you're going to see a reaction.
Yeah,
but it's like boiling the frog approach, right? So you see over time, actually, you know, what becomes a notable price point that's worthy at different times of day. You know, I think when you look at the way in which restaurants are thinking about dynamic pricing today, and you know, there are plenty out there that, by the way, are saying this is something we'll look at later. You know, we don't want to be the first guys to necessarily deploy it, and that's fine. That's just typical with any type of new innovation. Yeah. What we do find though is it's about how much they want to throw themselves into it if they are interested. So if you are going to do a discount or reduce the price, you're right, Danny. You're going to have to do something that's going to compel a customer to act. And so therefore that depends on the promotional mechanic itself and the level of weight that the customer is going to receive in terms of whether it's going to be through email, SMS, and app prompts, so that they are being made aware of it. It's, you know, you think about the last happy hour you guys went to. Did you go out of your way to that location for the happy hour, or did you sit down at the table and go, oh, it's happy hour? And then you were like, it's almost this gamified process, right? Thinking, well, we better order as quickly as we possibly can. And then you reach the end of the happy hour and you're looking at your watch going, well, we better get another beer in, or we better order some extra fries. So the same thing is going to happen for customers over time. But does that stop you from going to that restaurant after happy hour? No, it doesn't. I don't think so. I think you're still, if you turn up at another time, you're going to know it's no longer happy hour. You're not going to be begrudging of the fact it's no longer happy hour. It's just the rules of it. So I think, to your first question, if we condition customers to be able to spread the load across different time periods, I think that's a wonderful outcome for restaurants. I would be super excited about that, because the value-orientated customers will go to where the value is. And if your restaurant isn't offering it, then a restaurant is only a couple of clicks away that is offering it, and they'll get the customer that is seeking that.
I think the most cogent point there, and then we can wrap this up because we got 4 minutes left with you, is you are aware that the happy hour exists. And I think that still is where dynamic pricing has some room to go, which is, to your point, if it's an email, if it's a text, if it's a push notification, I think it's really important for consumers to know there's some level of effective pricing at play, either in the macro sense or in the micro sense in that moment. Like, hey, this is Tuesday at 3 p.m. pricing. just so that they're aware, so they can make that informed decision. Because I wonder if there's a level of sort of disconnect that just comes from seeing, the pennies kind of stack up over time. Do you agree that making the consumer aware is an important part of the strategy longer term, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you're going to deploy this in a way that is, both discounting, if you will, and increase in price, then I think it's important to empower the customer to be aware of that. I think it depends on which channels you wish to do it on.
Yeah.
If we think about what's happening on third parties today, customers are already getting dynamic prices, right? The delivery prices are changing based on the available delivery drivers in that particular area at that time. So customers are aware of it. They're accepting it. I don't think a restaurant needs to do anything more than that. It's just today, restaurants aren't taking any of that particular incremental margin. If you're going to broach this into the on-premise world, then I think absolutely we need to help customers understand that. We're going to have to train customers about what's happening and why it's happening. And that obviously is going to require a level of operational, burden to help them with that, which is why our focus initially is largely on off-premise, third party and first party. I think from there, it will expand into drive-through and kiosks. And then I think the closer we get to more CDPs and CRMs that are helping us understand different customer segments, then potentially you'll get to a world where your most loyal customers are treated exactly how they want to be treated.
Well, Carl, it's been a very informative 47 minutes. Thanks so much for, I don't know if that's the exact amount. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Final words, and then we'll let you get on to your, hopefully, dinner. Hopefully you don't have another meeting right now, but
I got another meeting, but that's all good. Look, thank you for having me on. For your listeners, if they'd like to get a copy of either of our books, they can get actually both of them for a combo $30 at our website, deliveringthedigitalrestaurant.com. So please go there. Also subscribe to our own podcast, which is the Digital Restaurant. We speak, Meredith and I, every couple of weeks about the latest goings on the world of restaurants, off-premise and technology. It's no promotions. It's just us talking for 15 minutes, a little bit like this here. And that's, doing well. And then finally, if you're interested in Juicer and everything we've talked about today, head to juicerpricing.com. Find me on LinkedIn if you'd like, DM me. Always happy to talk to anyone that's interested about this space. And we're looking forward to seeing where we take it in the years ahead.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Carl.
you, Carl.
Have a great night.
Thanks so much, guys.